Hello world, this is Lisa Friedrichsen, your friend and computer science professor with another short screencast, and this time I really want to drill down into the forEach method. The forEach method gives us a way to loop through all the items in an array and apply the same function to each item in the array. Sometimes it's called a callback function when we call that function back on each item in the array. So I've got a really short little HTML page here with an H1 and 5 images, and I've got an embedded script just to make this very convenient and put all the code in one file. So here's my array. It's called kitten names, and I'm assigning it to Tiger, Snowball, Ginger, and Harley. And here's our forEach method applied to that kitten names array. So here's the array name, dot method name, and then inside parentheses, I put my function that I want to run against each item in the array. So each item in the array is now given a variable name. I've said kitten. I could make that just K or any other variable name that I wanted to make it. And using arrow function syntax, here's my function inside the curly braces, the statements of my function. Console log out each kitten. And if I save that and refresh and look at my console, I can see on line 19 that this console log has run 1, 2, 3, 4 times, console logging out each name in the kitten names array, Tiger, Snowball, Ginger, Harley. Now, if you don't like arrow function yet, you could use the old function keyword syntax. And again, I'm going to have to give that function an argument variable name. Lots of times you'll use a singular value of whatever is inside your array because it just reads well. For each kitten in the kitten names array, let's console log out that kitten. But what variable name you use here is completely up to you. I'm going to prefer the arrow syntax because it's shorter. Now, if you're not used to the forEach method and this callback function that runs for every item in the array, let's look at the same thing using a for loop. This accomplishes the same thing as a for loop, except that the forEach method is much safer. In the forEach method, it didn't matter if my kittens names array had 1, 4, or 400 items. It's going to run this function once for every item in the array. On the for loop, however, I've got to initialize a counter, I've got to test the counter every time I go through the loop, and I've got to increment the counter. Those are 3 different places where I could make a mistake. And in this loop, I'm going to go ahead and console log again, but I'm going to concatenate the string for loop and then concatenate that to the names I, whatever item I'm in my array, and that's where we're getting these 4 statements from line 23. So this and this are equivalent. It's just that the forEach method, as opposed to the for loop, when you're looping through an array, is safer and shorter. Now I'm going to move this code down to the bottom of my script and put it in the comments so I don't get all those console logs in case we want to come back to it. And I want to show you how that concept works when you're working with elements in a web page. For example, I've got these 5 images, and there's a couple different ways that I could grab these 5 images. I could use the getElementsByTagName method and see what all these images in a list, or I could use the querySelectorAll method and then query for a particular CSS selector. If I'm going for a class name, of course I have to use the dot class name, same as the CSS selector. If I was just going for all images, I could just put in image here because that would be the CSS selector to style all images. See what we get in both the image list 1 case where I use getElementsByTagName and image list 2 where I use the querySelectorAll method. I'm going to save and refresh. There's a slight distinction here. getElementsByTagName gives me an HTML collection. And what's in that collection? Well, those 5 images. Whereas the querySelectorAll method returns a node list. And the node list is those same 5 images. The interesting thing about this is, even though both of these are lists, and therefore both of these are iterable, only the node list can use the forEach method. You cannot use the forEach method against an HTML collection. So what's neat about these methods is that they're returning a list. And lots of times people think that they're returning an array, and they're technically not arrays. However, every once in a while I'll get a student that thinks that they need to convert these lists into an array to use cool array methods such as forEach, and that is not always true. Now, the HTML collection list does not support the forEach method. However, the nodelist does. So let's try it. If I use image list 1, this is the HTML collection, and I use the forEach method against every item in that list, and I simply console log out the alt text for that image. Let's see what happens. Save, refresh, and I'm getting type error. Image list 1 forEach is not a function. So they're saying that forEach is not a function. It's not a valid method for the image list 1 for the HTML collection. Watch what happens when I change this to image list 2. Save, refresh. Then I'm console logging out on line 23 the alternate text, 5 kittens, pug puppy, tiger kitten, snowball, 2 puppies for each item in the node list. So what I want you to know is that when you grab items off of the web page and put them in a list using either of these methods, you get something that's slightly different than an array. However, oftentimes the array methods that you've already learned will work against these lists, even though they're technically not arrays. So the forEach method, which is super powerful, does work against a node list. It does not work against an HTML collection that's returned by the getElementsByTagName method, but it does work against a node list, which is returned by the querySelectorAll method. If I were to rewrite this without using the arrow syntax, it would look like this. Here's my function keyword instead of the arrow syntax. I'll save that and refresh that. And here on line 23, I'm console logging out the alternate text for those 5 images using arrow function. Here on line 27, I am console logging out the alternate text plus the number 2 using the old function keyword. And here, let's go ahead and use a for loop and do it the old-fashioned way, loop through each item in the image list 2 using the old for loop. And so I've just declared a for loop, initialize my counter. I'm going to go against the image 2 length. I'm going to increment by 1, and I'm going to console log out whatever's in that image list at that index level and the number 3, just to distinguish it. Save, refresh, and there we go. I'm getting 5 console logs from line 31 with the old for loop. One final question. Let's see if the old for loop works against a HTML collection, if it works against image list 1. Let's change this to 1, save, refresh, and yes, the old for loop does work against an HTML collection. In summary, use the forEach method against an array or against a node list. It is shorter code, it's more reliable code, but realize that the forEach method is just a fancier, more elegant way of running an old-fashioned for loop, and you can still run an old-fashioned for loop on an HTML collection. Thank you.